The crystalline dome of the Galactic Council chamber stretched impossibly high above, its transparent walls pulsing with the bioluminescent signatures of 1,000 worlds. Ambassador Robert Hayes stood in the center of the Judgment Circle. His simple black diplomatic uniform, a stark contrast to the elaborate ceremonial garments worn by the hundreds of alien representatives surrounding him. The air itself seemed to hum with ancient authority and barely contained hostility. Supreme Arbiter Telmore raised one of his 6 arms, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the chamber's ethereal light. His voice, when it came through the universal translators, carried the weight of 3 millennia of galactic governance. Human representative, your species stands accused of violating the fundamental protocols of civilized development. For 12 standard cycles, Earth has maintained complete communications blackout, refusing all overtures from this council. Robert remained motionless, his expression carefully neutral as hundreds of optical organs focused on him. The chamber held representatives from every major galactic civilization. The serpentine Cathari coiled nervously in their floating spheres, their scales shifting through spectrum of agitation. The massive Brogan delegates sat like living mountains, their stone-like features set in permanent scowls of disapproval. Even the energy-based Lummoth flickered with what he recognized as indignation. Furthermore, Telmore continued, his mandibles clicking ominously, our deep space monitoring stations have detected unauthorized military construction in your system's outer regions. The Council demands immediate explanation and unconditional surrender of all defensive capabilities for inspection and dismantlement. The chamber fell silent except for the low thrum of the massive station's engines and the occasional whisper of alien languages being translated in real time. Robert slowly raised his head, meeting the Supreme Arbiter's compound eyes with a calmness that seemed to disturb several of the watching delegates. You speak of protocols and violations, Robert said, his voice carrying clearly without amplification, but I wonder if this esteemed council truly understands what it has stumbled upon. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, and several of the alien representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Earth's silence wasn't defiance, Supreme Arbiter. It was patience. The Brogan war leader Gorthok slammed a massive fist onto his seat's armrest, cracking the crystalline surface. Patience? Your primitive world ignores the rightful authority of the Galactic Council and calls it patience? Robert turned his attention to the massive alien, his expression unchanged. War leader, your species has conquered 47 worlds in the past century. The Cathari have established economic dependencies across 32 systems. The Council itself has overseen the integration of over 200 developing civilizations. He paused, letting his words sink in. Yes, I would call our restraint patience. A ripple of unease spread through the assembly. Ambassador Silith of the Cathari delegation hissed softly, her scales now displaying the deep purple that indicated alarm among her species. How does this human possess such detailed knowledge of Council activities? Robert reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness. Security drones throughout the chamber immediately activated, their weapon systems powering up with audible whines. But he simply withdrew what appeared to be a small primitive device, nothing more than black metal and transparent crystal. For 85 years, Robert continued, holding up the device. We have watched you. Every transmission, every fleet movement, every diplomatic betrayal, every secret agreement. We know about the Cathari slave colonies hidden in the outer reaches. We know about the Brogan resource extraction operations on developing worlds. Most importantly, we know about the planned liberation of Earth scheduled to begin tomorrow. Supreme Arbiter Telmore's exoskeleton began to shift color, cycling through shades that indicated extreme agitation among his species. Impossible. Our communications are quantum encrypted across 19-dimensional phases. No developing species possesses the mathematical foundation to breach galactic standard encryption? Robert interrupted softly. You're absolutely correct. Fortunately for us, human mathematics doesn't recognize the same limitations as galactic standards. The device in his hand began to emit a soft blue glow, and suddenly every display screen throughout the massive chamber flickered to life. Detailed fleet formations appeared. Classified council documents scrolled past, and most damning of all, recorded conversations between the Supreme Arbiter and other species leaders discussing the Earth problem and its final solution. Chaos erupted throughout the chamber. Delegates leaped from their seats, pointing appendages at each other and demanding explanations. Security forces moved to surround Robert, who remained standing calmly in the eye of the storm, his finger still hovering over the device that had just shattered the Council's most guarded secrets. "The question before this Council," Robert said, his voice somehow cutting through the cacophony of outraged alien voices, "is no longer what Earth will surrender to avoid conquest. The question is what you're prepared to offer in exchange for our continued discretion about your crimes, and our continued restraint regarding our response to them." Supreme Arbiter Telmore struggled to restore order, his staff striking the crystal floor repeatedly. "What response? You represent a single world against the combined might of 800 galactic civilizations." Robert smiled then, and for the first time since entering the chamber it seemed genuinely warm. "Supreme Arbiter, that's the second incorrect assumption you've made today. The first was believing that silence indicated weakness." He gestured toward the screen still displaying the Council's darkest secrets. "The second is assuming that we came to this meeting alone." As if summoned by his words, the chamber's massive viewports began to shift, revealing space that had appeared empty moments before. Now dozens of sleek vessels materialized around the Council station, their dark hulls reflecting no light, their presence detected only now that they chose to be seen. 85 years of watching. Robert continued as stunned silence fell over the assembly. 85 years of learning. 85 years of preparing for this moment. Earth stayed silent because we hoped you would prove worthy of the power you wielded. Instead, you confirmed our darkest suspicions about what happens when military might becomes the foundation of political authority. The chamber's atmospheric processors seemed to struggle with the tension in the air as Robert looked up at the alien representatives, no longer a defendant, but somehow transformed into a judge pronouncing sentence. "The age of the Galactic Council's unchallenged authority ends today," he announced with quiet finality. "The question now is whether that end comes through negotiation or demonstration. The choice, esteemed representatives, is entirely yours." The emergency session had been called within minutes of Robert's revelation, but the damage to the Council's composure was already complete. The massive chamber buzzed with frantic communications as delegates contacted their homeworlds, seeking guidance for a situation no one had anticipated. Security forces had attempted to jam the human's device, only to discover that their most advanced countermeasures had no effect whatsoever. Supreme Arbiter Telmore had regained control of the proceedings, but his usual commanding presence seemed diminished. The screens around the chamber continued their relentless display of classified information, each revelation more damaging than the last. "Human representative," he began, his voice carefully modulated. "These alleged intercepts could be fabricated. Advanced civilizations have developed sophisticated deception technologies." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "An excellent point, Supreme Arbiter. Fortunately, verification is simple enough." He touched his device again, and the displays shifted to show real-time communications traffic flowing through the Council station itself. Private conversations between delegates, emergency military dispatches, even personal messages were laid bare for all to see. "This is happening now," Robert explained calmly as delegates watched their own secret communications appear on the screens. "Every thought you believe private, every order you consider secure, every alliance you imagine hidden. We see it all." War Leader Gorthak rose from his seat with a sound like grinding stone. "Even if this surveillance is real, what does one world hope to accomplish? The Brogan Empire alone commands 12,000 warships. The combined Council fleets number in the millions, 2,643,817 vessels to be precise," Robert corrected, "though that count excludes the supply ships and construction platforms. Quite impressive by any standard." He paused, seeming to consider his next words. "Unfortunately for you, impressive numbers mean very little when your enemy knows exactly where every ship is located at all times." The chamber's displays shifted again, now showing detailed fleet positions throughout Council space. Every major military installation, every patrol route, every hidden base was marked with clinical precision. Ambassador Sileth's scales had gone completely white, a color that among her species indicated existential terror. "This is impossible," whispered tech sage Morden of the Zephyrian Collective. "Our quantum detection grids would have identified any surveillance network capable of such comprehensive monitoring." The energy signatures alone would be detectable across multiple dimensions. Robert smiled at the insectoid being. Tech Sage, you're making the same error as your Supreme Arbiter. You're assuming that human technology operates within the same parameters as galactic science. He gestured toward the screens. Your detection grids are quite sophisticated, designed to identify energy patterns consistent with known physics. But what if the physics themselves were different? The human reached into his other pocket and withdrew a second device, this one appearing even more primitive than the first. It looked like nothing more than carved stone and metal wire. This probe was placed inside your personal laboratory 47 days ago, Tech Sage. It has been recording every experiment, every calculation, every theoretical breakthrough your team has achieved. Morden's compound eyes focused with laser intensity on the device. Impossible. My laboratory is shielded against all known forms of surveillance. Quantum isolation, dimensional barriers, temporal displacement fields, all quite effective against known surveillance methods, Robert agreed. This probe, however, exists in a state that your instruments cannot detect because they aren't designed to recognize it. Human physics has taken a somewhat different path than galactic science. Supreme Arbiter Telemore's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme distress among his species. What do you want, human? What does Earth hope to gain from this demonstration? Robert returned both devices to his pockets with deliberate care. What we want, Supreme Arbiter, is quite simple. We want you to cancel the invasion fleet currently moving toward our system. We want you to explain why the Galactic Council believes it has the authority to conquer sovereign worlds. And most importantly, we want you to justify why Earth should continue to show restraint when dealing with an organization that has clearly demonstrated its willingness to commit genocide. The word genocide hit the assembly like a physical blow. Several delegates began speaking at once, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of denial and outrage. But Robert continued speaking, his voice somehow cutting through the noise. Because that's what this is, isn't it? The plan calls for the elimination of human leadership, the relocation of population centers, the systematic dismantling of our technological base, and the integration of survivors into existing council member societies. In any reasonable definition, that constitutes the destruction of human civilization. War leader Gorthak pounded his massive fist on his armrest again. Integration is not genocide. The Council offers membership, prosperity, advancement beyond your primitive understanding. At the cost of our independence, our culture, and our right to determine our own fate, Robert replied. Tell me, War Leader, how many of the 200 worlds you've integrated still maintain their original governments? How many still speak their native languages? How many still practice their ancestral traditions? The silence that followed was answer enough. Robert nodded slowly. 0. The answer is 0 because the Council's definition of integration requires the complete erasure of everything that made those civilizations unique. He began walking slowly around the judgment circle, his hands clasped behind his back. For 85 years, Earth watched the Council operate. We studied your methods, your justifications, your ultimate goals. We hoped to find evidence that you were different from the conquering empires that had plagued our own history. Instead, we discovered that you had simply refined the process. Supreme Arbiter Telmore struggled to maintain his composure. The Council maintains peace across 800 worlds. Without our guidance, the galaxy would descend into chaos and warfare. Robert stopped walking and faced the Supreme Arbiter directly. Peace? Is that what you call the systematic suppression of developing civilizations? The forced relocation of entire species? The economic exploitation disguised as trade agreements? His expression hardened. Because from where Earth sits, it looks more like the most successful protection racket in galactic history. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the full implications of Robert's words sank in. These weren't the desperate accusations of a primitive species facing conquest. This was a calculated indictment delivered by someone who had gathered evidence for nearly a century. The question before this council, Robert continued, is no longer whether Earth will submit to integration. The question is whether the Galactic Council is prepared to face judgment for its crimes against countless civilizations. The second emergency recess had lasted 6 hours, during which the Galactic Council's leadership engaged in the most frantic diplomatic activity in the organization's 3,000-year history. When the session reconvened, the atmosphere in the chamber had shifted from hostile authority to barely concealed desperation. Several delegate seats now sat empty. their occupants having been recalled by homeworld governments that suddenly questioned the wisdom of confronting humanity. Supreme Arbiter Telmore looked like he had aged decades during the break. His exoskeleton bore stress fractures that hadn't been there before, and his movements lacked their earlier commanding confidence. "Ambassador Hayes," he began, his voice carefully controlled. "My government has confirmed the presence of your vessels throughout Council space. Our deep space monitors have also detected certain anomalies in your home system that support your claims regarding defensive capabilities." Robert nodded from his position in the judgment circle, where he had remained throughout the entire proceedings. "I appreciate your honesty, Supreme Arbiter. It saves us all considerable time and reduces the likelihood of unfortunate misunderstandings." War Leader Gorthak leaned forward aggressively, his massive frame casting shadows across the chamber floor. "Your stealth technology is impressive, human. But surely you don't believe a few dozen ships can challenge the combined might of the Council's entire military apparatus." Robert reached for his data device again, causing every security system in the chamber to activate simultaneously. "War Leader, you're making several assumptions that I should probably correct. First, you've assumed that the vessels you detected represent the full extent of Earth's military capabilities. The device activated, and the chamber's holographic displays came online, showing what appeared to be Earth's solar system. But this wasn't the same system the Council's surveys had documented for decades. Instead of mostly empty space punctuated by occasional mining operations, the display revealed a vast network of installations throughout the asteroid belt, hidden construction facilities on moons, and structures that defied immediate classification. Second, Robert continued as stunned delegates absorbed the images, you've assumed that military strength is measured purely in ship counts. Humans learned early in our development that survival often depends less on having the biggest army and more on ensuring your enemy can never accurately assess your true capabilities. The hologram zoomed in on what the Council had catalogued as a simple research station on Titan. The display revealed it to be a massive manufacturing complex, its interior filled with vessels unlike anything in known galactic databases. The ships were sleek, organic-looking things that seemed to bend light around themselves even in the holographic representation. Tech Sage Morden's voice came out as barely a whisper. "How many vessels?" "That depends on your definition," Robert replied thoughtfully. "If you mean traditional warships designed for fleet engagement, approximately 11,000. But if you include our autonomous defense platforms, rapid deployment units, and what we call contingency assets." He paused, appearing to calculate. "Roughly 54,000 combat-capable units currently operational." The chamber erupted in disbelief. Ambassador Sileth's scales flickered rapidly through the entire spectrum of her species' emotional range. "Fabrication. No single world could construct such a fleet without massive resource imports. Our trade monitoring systems would have detected the material transfers necessary for—" "Would they?" Robert interrupted mildly. "Tell me, Ambassador, how carefully do you monitor the internal resource utilization of species classified as developing? When our mining ships collected asteroids, did it occur to anyone to question why we were quite so selective about which asteroids we chose? When our research stations studied our outer planets, did the Council wonder why we needed quite so many research stations?" The implications were staggering. For 8 decades, the Galactic Council had dismissed Earth as a developing world, beneath their notice except as a potential future member. They had watched human space activities with the casual attention reserved for species still centuries away from interstellar capability. War Leader Gorthak rose slowly from his seat, his massive frame trembling with what might have been rage or fear. "Even if these numbers are accurate, human, you face the same fundamental problem that has destroyed every species that has challenged Council authority. Resources. You may have ships, but you cannot match our industrial capacity, our established supply networks, our infrastructure spanning 800 worlds." Robert smiled, and this time there was something almost predatory in the expression. "War Leader, you're absolutely correct. In a traditional war of attrition, Earth would eventually lose through simple mathematics. Our industrial base, however advanced, cannot match the combined output of 800 worlds. But then again, who mentioned anything about fighting a traditional war?" He activated his device again, and the holographic display shifted to show technical schematics that made several delegates gasp in recognition. The designs appeared to violate several fundamental principles of galactic physics. While we were maintaining our strategic invisibility, Robert explained, we also solved a few technical problems that have apparently eluded galactic science for millennia. Problems related to faster-than-light communication without quantum entanglement, dimensional storage without spatial displacement, and most importantly, the schematic zoomed in on a component that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Instantaneous matter transmission across unlimited distances. The silence that followed was absolute. Tech Sage Morden was the first to find his voice. That's impossible. The energy requirements alone would require the output of multiple stars. The quantum destabilization would tear apart local spacetime. The mathematical paradoxes involved would indeed be insurmountable using galactic mathematical frameworks, Robert agreed. Fortunately, human mathematics developed along somewhat different lines. We've had functional prototypes of this technology for 18 years. Supreme Arbiter Telmore slumped in his ceremonial chair, the weight of realization crushing down upon him. Earth wasn't just hiding advanced military technology. They had achieved breakthroughs that could revolutionize galactic civilization, and they had done it in complete isolation from the very institution that claimed to guide galactic development. What do you want from us? The Supreme Arbiter asked, his voice aging him centuries with each word. Robert stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. What I want, Supreme Arbiter, is very simple. I want you to explain to me why the Galactic Council believed it had the right to plan the invasion and forced integration of a sovereign world. I want you to justify 8 decades of surveillance and preparation for conquest. And then, his expression hardened into something that made several delegates shrink back in their seats. I want you to convince me why Earth shouldn't respond to your planned genocide with methods that the Council would find infinitely more unpleasant. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Around the chamber, the representatives of 800 worlds suddenly found themselves facing a species they had underestimated in every possible way. Earth had not just been watching them for 8 decades. Earth had been preparing for war. The third emergency recess had stretched through an entire galactic standard day, during which the Galactic Council's most senior leadership engaged in desperate communications with their respective homeworlds. When the assembly reconvened, nearly a quarter of the delegate seats remained empty, their occupants either recalled by governments suddenly questioning the wisdom of this confrontation, or simply too terrified to return to the chamber. Supreme Arbiter Telmore appeared to have aged years during the break. His exoskeleton bore fresh stress fractures, and his usual commanding presence had been replaced by the careful movements of someone who knew they were walking through a minefield. Ambassador Hayes, he began, his voice carrying a tremor that hadn't been there before. The Council has received confirmations from our respective governments regarding the accuracy of your claims about surveillance and fleet positioning. Robert had spent the entire recess exactly where they had left him, sitting calmly in the defendant's chair, occasionally consulting his devices with the casual air of someone reading routine reports. I'm pleased that verification was possible, Supreme Arbiter. Truth has a way of revealing itself, regardless of how inconvenient it might be. Ambassador Sileth leaned forward, her scales now cycling through colors that indicated severe psychological distress. What we fail to understand is the purpose behind this revelation. If Earth possessed such capabilities, why maintain the deception for so long? Why allow the Council to proceed with integration planning if you could have prevented it at any time? Robert set down his data device and stood, beginning to pace slowly around the judgment circle. That's an excellent question, Ambassador. The answer lies in something humans call strategic patience. We needed to understand not just your capabilities, but your true intentions, your authentic character as both individuals and as an institution. He gestured toward the screens that still displayed intercepted communications and invasion plans. For 85 years, we observed the Council present itself as a benevolent union of species, dedicated to peace and mutual prosperity throughout the galaxy. We documented your diplomatic missions, your trade agreements, your public declarations of universal cooperation and advancement. Robert's expression hardened as he continued. Yet when faced with a single world that chose isolation over membership, your immediate and unanimous solution was military conquest. No genuine attempt at negotiation, no respect for sovereignty, no consideration of self-determination, simply the automatic assumption that any species, Refusing to join your council must be eliminated or forcibly integrated, War Leader. Gorthak slammed his massive fist onto his armrest with enough force to crack the crystalline surface. Earth rejected every diplomatic overture. Your species ignored all attempts at peaceful contact and integration. Did we? Robert asked mildly. Or did we simply fail to respond with the immediate submission you expected? He activated his device again, and new recordings appeared on the chamber's displays, documentation of the Council's so-called diplomatic missions to Earth. Over the decades, the recordings showed what appeared to be standard first contact protocols to the casual observer, but Robert provided disturbing context that reframed everything. Mission 1. The Council's diplomatic vessel maintained active weapon locks on 3 of our major population centers throughout the entire communication attempt. Mission 2. Your ambassadors demanded immediate and unrestricted access to our military installations, industrial facilities, and governmental archives. Mission 3. You explicitly stated that refusal to join the Council would result in Earth being classified as a hostile developing entity subject to forcible integration. The implications were devastating. What the Council had recorded as peaceful diplomatic overtures were revealed as ultimatums backed by the implicit threat of overwhelming force. The chamber fell into uncomfortable silence as delegates realized how their diplomacy appeared from the receiving end. Tech Sage Morden spoke carefully, his insectoid features twitching with nervous energy. Even granting the validity of your concerns about our diplomatic methods, your response seems disproportionate. The development of secret military technology, the comprehensive deception, the infiltration of sovereign council space has been purely defensive, Robert interrupted firmly. Until now. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. Supreme Arbiter Telmore's mandibles clicked rapidly in distress. What do you mean, until now? Robert stopped pacing and fixed the Supreme Arbiter with a stare that made the ancient being visibly recoil. I mean that Earth's patience has finally reached its limit. For 85 years, we watched the Council's treatment of developing species across the galaxy. We documented the forced relocations, the resource extraction agreements that amounted to economic slavery, the selective enforcement of your precious protocols based on political convenience rather than justice. He activated his device once more, and the screens began displaying a comprehensive record of the Council's activities across dozens of systems, activities that painted a very different picture of galactic governance than their carefully maintained public image suggested. The Cathari colony ships that disappeared in the outer reaches, they were captured and enslaved by your Brogan allies with full Council knowledge and tacit approval. The natural disaster that devastated the Zertani homeworld, artificially induced to force their admission to the Council under emergency humanitarian provisions. The systematic elimination of the Pothek leadership caste, orchestrated by Council intelligence services to install a more compliant government. Enough. War Leader Gorthak roared, rising to his full intimidating height. Even if these accusations were accurate, what gives one primitive world the right to judge the policies of the Galactic Council? What authority does Earth claim over civilizations that have existed since before your species discovered fire? Robert smiled then, and the expression sent chills through every being present. The authority, War Leader, comes from capability. And capability, as we have thoroughly demonstrated, is something Earth possesses in considerable abundance. He returned to his seat with deliberate care, settling back with an air of someone who had just concluded the opening statements of a trial. Which brings us to the real purpose of this meeting. Earth is prepared to make the Galactic Council an offer, our final offer. The chamber fell into absolute silence as every being present leaned forward, dreading but desperate to hear what humanity was about to demand. Dissolve the Galactic Council as a governing body, Robert said with devastating simplicity. Return autonomous governance to all member species. Cease all forced integration programs immediately. End all military activities against developing worlds. Release all species currently held under economic dependency agreements. He paused, letting the enormity of his demands sink in. In exchange, Earth will share our technological advances with all galactic civilizations equally, without political conditions or economic exploitation. Supreme Arbiter Telmore's exoskeleton began shifting through rapid color changes, a sign of extreme psychological distress among his species. You're demanding that we dismantle the institutional structure that has maintained galactic peace and prosperity for 3,000 years. Peace? Robert asked, raising an eyebrow as he gestured toward the damning evidence still displayed around the chamber. Prosperity? Is that truly what you call the systematic oppression and exploitation of hundreds of civilizations? His expression grew cold. Because from where Earth sits, it looks more like the most successful protection racket in galactic history, dressed up in the language of benevolent governance. War Leader Gorthak's voice dropped to a dangerous growl. And if the Council refuses your ultimatum? Robert's smile returned, colder than the vacuum of space. Then, War Leader, you will discover what happens when a species bred for survival decides to stop playing by rules, designed to ensure their subjugation. His, voice carried undertones that made even the most battle-hardened delegates present feel unexpectedly vulnerable, because the one thing Earth learned from studying the Council's history is that some institutions only understand one language. And after 85 years of preparation, humanity has become remarkably fluent in that particular dialect. The final emergency session had been called with unprecedented urgency, and for the first time in the Galactic Council's 3,000-year history, the chamber hosted what could only be described as a surrender negotiation. The massive crystalline dome that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations now bore witness to the most dramatic shift in galactic power since the Council's founding. Supreme Arbiter. Telmore sat slumped in his ceremonial chair, the weight of inevitable defeat crushing down upon his ancient frame. Nearly half of the delegate seats now stood empty, their occupants having fled rather than face what was coming. Those who remained did so with the hollow-eyed expression of beings who had watched their entire understanding of galactic politics crumble in the span of days. Ambassador Hayes, Telmore began, his voice carrying none of its former authority. The Council has deliberated extensively on your proposal. The dissolution of a 3,000-year-old institution cannot be decided hastily. We require additional time to consider the implications. 6 hours, Robert interrupted calmly, consulting his data device with casual indifference. Ambassador Sileth's scales flared bright red with indignation. 6 hours? To dismantle the entire structure of galactic governance? To undo 3 millennia of carefully balanced interstellar relations? Impossible. Actually, Robert corrected with that same unsettling mildness. 6 hours to decide whether you prefer an orderly transition of power or a more kinetic alternative. He activated his device, and the chamber's screens displayed real-time tactical information that made several delegates visibly recoil in terror. The MO display showed that Earth's hidden fleet had moved into striking position around every major Council military installation, capital world, and strategic resource center throughout known space. Somehow, while the Council had been debating and negotiating, humanity had deployed across half the galaxy without being detected until this moment. War Leader Gorthak studied the tactical display with the experienced eye of a career military officer, his expression growing more grim by the moment. Your vessels are positioned inside our primary defensive perimeters. They're targeting critical infrastructure points that would cripple our entire governmental apparatus. How is such deployment possible without detection? War Leader, I believe you're still fundamentally misunderstanding the scope of human capabilities. Robert replied with something that might have been sympathy. These aren't vessels that traveled to their current positions during our negotiations. These are assets that were already in place, waiting for activation orders. The implication hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow. Tech Sage Morden's compound eyes focused with laser intensity on the human representative. You mean to say that your species has maintained combat-ready forces throughout Council space for how long? Our strategic positioning began approximately 23 years ago, Robert answered matter-of-factly. We've been placing assets throughout Council space since we first confirmed your intentions to forcibly integrate Earth into your alliance system. Supreme Arbiter. Telmore's exoskeleton had now gone completely gray, a color that among his species indicated total resignation. Your species has been executing a military campaign against the Council for over 2 decades, and we never knew the war had begun. Not a military campaign, Robert corrected gently. A defensive strategy. Humans learned early in our development that when facing a more powerful opponent, direct confrontation is suicide. Instead, we adapted. We learned to think in longer timescales, to plan for contingencies our enemies couldn't imagine, to turn patience into a weapon more devastating than any fleet. Robert stood and walked toward the chamber's massive viewports, where the hulks of Council defense platforms drifted powerless after being systematically disabled by weapons no one had seen coming. The Galactic Council made several critical errors in its assessment of humanity. First, you assume that technological advancement follows predictable patterns. Second, you believe that a species' current visible capabilities accurately reflect their hidden potential. Third, and most fatally, you assumed that cooperation and submission were synonymous. He turned back to face the assembly, his expression almost sympathetic. But perhaps the greatest error was assuming that humanity's offer of peaceful coexistence was a sign of weakness, rather than restraint. Ambassador Silith found her voice, though it trembled with barely controlled fear. What you're proposing? The complete restructuring of galactic civilization. It would take decades to implement properly. Entire economic systems would collapse. Political structures spanning centuries would disintegrate. Billions of beings depend on the current order for their survival. Then I suggest the Council begin immediately, Robert replied without hesitation, because whether you choose cooperation or resistance changes coming to this galaxy. The only variable is how much of the existing infrastructure survives the transition. War Leader Gorthak made one final desperate attempt at defiance. Even with your technological advantages, you cannot govern a galaxy from a single world. You lack the administrative experience, the institutional knowledge, the simple personnel numbers required to manage 800 civilizations. Robert's expression shifted to genuine surprise. War Leader, I think you've fundamentally misunderstood our intentions. Earth has absolutely no interest in governing the galaxy or ruling over other species. He activated his device one final time, and the chamber's displays showed something unprecedented. Detailed specifications for human technology, freely distributed. Faster-than-light communication, dimensional storage, instantaneous matter transmission defensive systems, decades of human innovation offered without restriction or political strings. Every species receives identical access. Robert explained as stunned delegates stared at the treasure trove of advanced science being freely shared. No licensing agreements, no trade restrictions, no political obligations. We're providing you with the tools to build genuine prosperity and independence, without requiring submission to any central authority. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the delegates realized what they were witnessing. This wasn't conquest in any recognizable form. It was something far more radical and terrifying to entrenched power structures. Earth was offering to destroy the entire foundation of galactic politics by making every species technologically independent. Supreme Arbiter Telmor's voice was barely a whisper. You would destabilize the entire galactic order. Robert smiled, and for the first time since entering the chamber it seemed genuinely warm. Supreme Arbiter, the galaxy has been destabilized for 3,000 years by an organization that confused military supremacy with legitimate governance. We're offering to stabilize it through genuine freedom and technological independence. He walked back toward his seat, pausing to address the assembly one final time. Earth stayed silent for 85 years because we hoped the Council would prove worthy of the trust placed in it by hundreds of civilizations. Instead, you confirmed our worst fears about what happens when unchecked power becomes the foundation of political order. His expression grew serious. But unlike the Council, we believe in redemption, in growth, in the possibility that even the most entrenched systems can change when given proper motivation and genuine alternatives. He settled back into his chair with the satisfied air of someone who had just concluded the most important negotiation in galactic history. 6 hours, distinguished representatives. Your respective governments are undoubtedly already receiving detailed reports about our fleet positions and technological capabilities. I strongly suggest you use the remaining time to convince them that cooperation represents a far more attractive option than the alternatives, as the Council delegates began frantically communicating with their homeworlds. Robert Hayes sat calmly in the center of the chamber that had once been designed to pass judgment on humanity. Now it had become the birthplace of a new galactic era, one where power would be distributed rather than concentrated, where technology would liberate rather than enslave. and where the silence Earth had maintained for so long would finally give way to a voice that demanded justice. The age of the Galactic Council was ending. The age of true galactic freedom was about to begin, and Earth, which had stayed silent for so long, had finally spoken with a voice that would reshape the destiny of countless worlds.